coming up. Giotto.
Yeah.
Giotto.
Yeah, yeah.
Giotto.
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 Yeah.
Particularly Giotto. I personally am sick of going around museums and seeing the same old thing again and again.
And I personally really love going around museums and seeing the same old things again and again.
What is this piece?
Yeah, I'm just reading from your notes, James. Hello, my name is Leslie Primo, and I'm the author of The Foreign Invention of British Art.
And my name is James Payne, and I'm the author of Great Art Explained.
So, what are we going to talk about today, James?
We're actually going to talk about the American artist Faith Ringgold, and probably one of the most important American artists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Yeah. I'm a big fan, and I've got to admit, I came to Faith Ringgold's work quite late, actually, really. I didn't really know much about her. Went to that Serpentine exhibition, and it was absolutely amazing. Never seen anything like it before. James, you probably know a lot more about her than I do.
Possibly. I mean, I'm a huge fan as well.
Yeah.
But what was it like for you when you met her? What was she actually like?
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, you're absolutely, James. I actually met Faith Ringgold, and it was so casual. We went to I went to the Serpentine. I had no expectations of actually meeting Faith. I thought I was just going to the show, like most punters going to the show. So it wasn't even a special day where it was a special walk round. It may have been, but I seem to have just walked straight into the middle of it, and there she was, taking a few people around the gallery, looking at her works and actually talking about the works in front of them. And that was extraordinary. I just tagged along, of course. And I like the way that she talked about the works in a really casual way, but they were quite succinct and precise. The meanings of the works were absolutely exact and precise. She knew what, she wanted, there was no room for us to sort of say, oh, it could mean this or it could mean that. She knew exactly what the works meant, and she was entirely lucid about the works that were there. It gave me an insight that I clearly never had before.
That's amazing. I'm very jealous. If you don't know much about Faith Ringgold, there are lots of interviews with her on YouTube that you can check out. And as Leslie said, she's very succinct. She's much older. By the time you met her, she was much older. She's had a long career.
Indeed.
And we're going to talk about where she came from and her attitude to life, really, I suppose.
Yeah, and did you wanted to get in a sort of quote at this early
I'm
stage?
going to. So she is actually a chapter in my book,
right?
And so I'd like to read. She was born in 1930, so she really lived through these pivotal moments. Oh, by the way, she died in 2024. If you're wondering if she was still alive, and this I set up in my book her origins. So here we go. Her great-grandparents were enslaved, but her grandparents both became teachers, and she grew up in a family that saw education as a way to fly. Ringgold inherited her grandparents' tenacity and determination and succeeded in getting a place at the City College of New York, where she received her bachelor's and master's degree in visual arts. America was a divided nation in the 1950s. Violence was rife, and protests were breaking out across the country against racial segregation. On the 28th of August 1963, 250,000 people marched on Washington as part of the rapidly expanding civil rights movement. It was here that the world heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech for the first time.
Well, that's extraordinary, isn't it? It's very powerful. And what it reminds us, of course, is that these events that seem to have happened a long time ago or somehow in the past, well, they're not in the past. Many of the people that were, in fact, pro-segregation are still with us now, still alive. They're much older, still in government. They're older, but they're still with us now. Yeah. And Faith Ringgold lived through these times. And I think what's really interesting that what you've said there, James, in there is that how she was tenacious in terms of wanting to forge a career for herself. Yeah. And this is one of the things that when you're an outsider and you're discriminated against, you have to work 10 times harder than everybody else around you to achieve the same position that they're already in. Yeah. So that sort of tenacity, that's a thing that a lot of people of colour have to go through all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do think that, the reason I wanted to start with that quote about the civil rights movement in America, because it changed her as well, because, she grew up in, she describes her childhood as happy and protected. She was very happy as a child. Her parents were very comforting and very warm to her. But she did grow up in Harlem during the Great Depression, so she's eventually going to get into art school via circuitous routes.
Yeah.
But then she's really pretty much doing academic work. So she's doing academic work. She's doing landscapes and flowers and things like that. That was the work she was doing at the time.
Yes.
And while all this, she was 32 when Martin Luther King was giving his speech, you know. And it was an awakening for her. And that's interesting that she saw that as an awakening. And then a gallerist said to her, why are you doing this work?
Yeah.
Why are you not doing work about what's going on in the world?
Yes.
And that's when she started doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's this idea, isn't it, of using your strengths and recognizing that this is actually part of your USP. What is going on in your life around you can be your art and can be a way of expressing how you feel about what's going on around you. And when you find out that, then you're off, aren't you?
And it's funny that nowadays we think of her as a very political artist. You know, she addresses racism, sexism, war. She talks about war quite often. She talks about power. She talks about historical erasure and all those subjects. But really, she didn't start that way. You know, that was something that came about because of what was happening in America at the time.
But, you know, that's an interesting point, actually, James, because, in fact, just being black is political.
Yeah,
and that's what a lot of black, African Americans will say, and increasingly a lot of Black British people are saying as well. Just being black is political, and there's no escape from it because it's part of your everyday life. So whether you like it or not, you have to be political. You have to know about these things, because if you don't know about them, well, people are already willing to gaslight you.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah,
and it's something we need to be very, very aware of. I mean, I need to be aware of this. I think, you know, we've talked about this quite a lot. We spoke about it in another podcast as well. Leslie is one of the great lecturers at the National Gallery, you know, yet
Well, you know, I joined the National Gallery in 2000 and I became a lecturer at the National Gallery. In fact, the first person of colour to lecture at the National Gallery. The National Gallery itself opened in 1824, and the building that it's in now is 1838. So over that long period of time, no persons of colour giving lectures in the gallery until I come along in 2000.
And yet, when you're going to the National Gallery, you're still approached as if you're working there as a guard occasionally.
Indeed, yes. When I go into the National Gallery, people come up to me and ask me where the toilets are, where the shops are. Yeah. Can you work the audio guides for me? You name it, anything. And some American guy came up to me once and said, why aren't you wearing a jacket? And I had no idea what that meant, why you wearing a jacket. And I just finished giving a lecture at the other part of the gallery. I was walking back, I had a shirt and presentable trousers on, all that sort of stuff. And in the end, when he walked away, I realised what he meant. Because I looked around and I saw that the security guards were wearing jackets. And of course, what he meant was that I should have been wearing a jacket because he thought I was a security guard. Yeah. But it didn't make any sense at the time he was actually saying it.
This is very sobering. And I do think that it's really important that, you know, there are many, many people who have always criticised Faith Ringgold for being political. It's like, well, you know, you work with what you've got. You have to work with what you've got.
Faith Ringgold didn't have a choice about being political or not, really. Yeah. It is foisted on her, and she worked with it.
Yeah, and I want to talk about as well the fact that, you know, she even says in her autobiography, she says that it was an awakening for her what was happening in America in this period of history. But she comes from that cultural background already, because she grew up in Harlem in the 1930s. Yeah. And she was at the end of, a recipient of the Harlem Renaissance, which I would really like to talk to, because I think it's one of our most interesting periods of art and literature as well.
Yeah, and it's using that word that I like using a lot, Renaissance.
Renaissance, you're a Renaissance expert. Yes, yeah. But I'd like to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, because this is centered around Harlem in New York, of course. And the rough period, there's only a rough idea. In the same way as the Renaissance, it's a rough idea.
It's a rough idea, yeah. About 1420 to about 1600.
Roughly.
Yeah, roughly.
So you know, art movements are never exactly correct. No. But anyway, so the Harlem Renaissance is roughly from 1910 to the 1930s. And this is not just involving artists, it's involving political agitators, it's involving musicians, thinkers, and writers, lots and lots of writers involved as well. So Ringgold herself, she was friends or knew Bessie Smith. One of my favorite artists is Jacob Lawrence. She knew the great poet
Langston Hughes.
Langston Hughes, she knew him.
Yes, yeah.
She lived around the corner from Duke Ellington, and she knew Billie Holiday. And you know what the interesting thing I found out about the Harlem Renaissance recently? So I recently read a book about it, and it was saying how Louis Armstrong lived in Harlem in the 1930s, but by this period he was very rich. He was very wealthy.
Well,
so why would he live in Harlem, which was a poor area?
Yeah.
Because it was safe.
Yeah,
it was a safe place for him to live. And he didn't have to face segregation.
Yeah,
he didn't have to face what was going on in the outside world.
Yeah,
so it was a really powerful time in history.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? That he's in that place, because it is a community. Isn't it,
community.
Really? It's
a big community.
Yeah, it's a big community. Yeah. And also, I want to, what I'm astonished about, it must be said, is that I actually got to speak to somebody who knew Billie Holiday.
Oh wow! Really? Wow!
I mean, Faith Ringgold knew Billie Holiday. I spoke to her, that mean, degrees.
Once removed, or
degrees of separation. That's extraordinary. Yeah.
So why do you think? Why was it Harlem? Why was Harlem the focal point of the Harlem Renaissance rather than any other American city?
Well, of course, there's a mass migration, isn't there, really, to that part, that city in particular. And effectively, what we're seeing is African Americans not being able to live anywhere else.
Yeah.
And, often we talk about ghettos, but what we don't talk about as well is how these ghettos form. They form because of white flight, because white people say, I'm not living next door to somebody black, so I'm moving. And then other black people say, well, I want to live somewhere I'm safe, like Louis Armstrong, with other black people. And all of a sudden you have a sort of situation where all the same sort of people are living in that area. A certain politician said recently, I don't see any English people around here, or don't see any English voices. But there's a reason for that, really. The reason is white flight. Yeah,
and then there's also, people migrating. So I think from 1916 to 1970, 1917, 6 million African Americans, they moved from the south to the north. So there was access to property as well. So there were buildings there they could move into.
But they're escaping Jim Crow laws. That's what they're doing.
They're escaping the Jim Crow laws and racial violence as well that was going on in this period, and segregation, so they could live comfortably. But also what that means is quite interesting. Is they move into an area with lots and lots of houses. They're going to run out of space. 6 million people is a lot of people to move into an area. So it gets very dense. It gets very dense. And that forms an even more closer knit community, and that forms a political community as well. And in the same way, housing estates in the UK or anywhere,
they all have something in common.
Yeah, they have something in common.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to live in a place where you have something in common. I often say this to people. I say, look, you go to Spain. There are whole areas in Spain where there's nobody actually Spanish speaking there. There are English speakers or German speakers, but there's no Spanish people there. And that's an enclave of English-speaking people or German-speaking people. That is just as much as it were, a ghetto as anywhere else. But unfortunately, those people decide to call themselves expats rather than immigrants, which is what they are.
Yeah. And we know the word ghetto didn't come from race.
No, it did not. No,
from Italy.
It came from Italy, of course. Yes, of course. I spend every year in Venice, so of course that
And if you don't know that the gettare, which is the Italian word, means foundry, and it was a foundry island where the Jews were exiled from Venice. So it became the very first ghetto.
Yes, exactly, and that forms the very idea. And it's interesting how these words come from somewhere that actually doesn't have anything to do with people of colour whatsoever. These words, even plantations. The first plantations and plantation culture happened in Ireland, Southern Ireland, and then once they'd learned how to do it, then they transported it to the West Indies.
Yeah, and it's under Queen Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth I,
in the Republic of Ireland.
Yes, exactly.
But going back to Harlem, anyway. So many people who lived in Harlem. I mean, I just can't. To me, I love this period of history because there were just so many different people involved. Like Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican political activist.
Yeah.
He's going to move here as well. So lots of immigrants are moving in. People with really strong traditions as well. So this is all changing as well. So and so what you're getting is you are getting a ghetto, but you're not going to get a ghetto mentality. It's a global mentality, and it's kind of spreading out. Well, but she grew up with this as a child.
And you can see how that would have fed her creative imagination. to have that sort of community around you and a supportive community as well. And it's interesting that I think, in my opinion, I'm all for immigration, really. Let's just get it out there on the table now. More immigration, excellent, because immigration, it actually leads to wonderful creativity.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's what my book is all about, really, The Foreign Invention of British Art. And that's why I want to read just a small passage from here about immigration itself and the benefits of immigration. In fact, we know that these immigrants were not treated very well, it must be said as well. In fact, there was quite a lot of dissent against immigration as well. And here's a small passage about the dissent against foreign workers that had been growing in England for well over a century. And in 1470, Kentish rioters descended on the capital, that's London, attacking the homes, not of people of colour, but of French people, Germans and Flemish immigrants. And they were all attacked on this day. And then, of course, there was the so-called evil May Day riots that happened in the spring of 1517. And there hundreds of Londoners' ransacked the homes of businesses and immigrants in an attempt to destroy their livelihoods and create, and I quote, a hostile environment for aliens, as they were called, most of whom were from the Low Countries, France and Italy and various German states.
Yeah, and this is something that is still ongoing. It's something that's still ongoing in the world, that people have a fear of the foreigner, and the thing is that, getting back to Faith Ringgold, is that everything she did, if you don't know her work, I mean, I think the most important thing to think about her is that she's a storyteller. She tells stories. Her work is about telling stories, and that comes from that kind of African diaspora in Harlem. It comes from the Caribbean mentality of telling stories.
So, James, do you want to talk about the mediums that she used to tell those stories? Because didn't she use quilts?
Yeah, she used quilts eventually. So she had a very long career, but she came to success very late. In a really circuitous way and fortuitous way.
At the same time, right?
So she had a very strange. So she was doing very political work, very, very political work. She had to struggle to sell her work because it was so political. She was also doing demonstrations. She was demonstrating outside the Met. She was throwing flour and all this kind of stuff and eggs. And then she she wrote her autobiography very early on. She tried to sell it. Nobody was interested. People weren't that interested in her work at all. And then she wrote a children's story called Tar Beach. And she wrote a children's story called Tar Beach, and it was published as a children's book.
Right.
And
was that political, James?
It was, yeah.
A children's book?
Well, she said all children's books are political.
Oh, did she?
Yeah. So there you go. So give me a chance to give a good quote about her. So she wrote this children's book. It became hugely successful, and it's based on one of her quilts. So yes,
right.
That's where she come from. That's where she got known for.
Right.
But was making quilts with her mother, by the way. With her mother, she started making quilts early on.
Yeah.
They didn't go very far successfully, but the first quilt she made, which became a success eventually, were made with her mother, who unfortunately died pretty soon after she started working with her.
Right.
And her mother was a fashion designer.
Oh,
so she was used to materials. So she was using discarded material, repurposed, as we say these days.
Repurposed, that's
material.
right. Yeah.
And
upcycled.
Upcycled, yeah. And this comes from a long, quilt making in America is very political.
It is, yeah.
It is.
And are you aware of the quilt makers of G Bend?
Yes,
absolutely.
very much. In fact, it's in my chapter of my book.
I thought, because there was an exhibition, of course, at the Royal Academy that featured the works of the quilt makers of G Bend. And again, that was an awakening for me, a new thing for me, because, coming from the original Renaissance as I do, I have no knowledge of this stuff at all. But again, extraordinary.
Yeah, so do you want to explain about the women of G Bend?
The women of G Bend, yeah. And what I found interesting about the women of G Bend was that as I walked around looking at this exhibition, it turns out they all seem to have similar names to each other. And it seems as though they're all from particular families, and the family names have gone on and carried on throughout the other makers. And the quilts themselves, of course, extraordinary, in very good condition. And these are quilts that were made expressly as works of art.
Yeah.
They weren't like quilts and then became art. They were art from the outset.
And these women were mostly indigenous women of America. So this became a political. I mean, the quilt making has got a long history in America, even before politics.
Yes.
So when the founders of America were going over, they were making scraps of wood. In fact, some of those are worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands and have their own museums. And then the women, then these Native American women were making these quilts, and they became famous in the 1970s, really, those quilts. And so Faith Ringgold is taking that and taking it a little bit further as well.
Yes, exactly.
And it's a really interesting thing, because you're taking women are taking a craft and making it into an art, we can be very disparaging about craft.
Yes. But that's a reclaiming of it, isn't it, really? And in a way, it makes it really difficult for critics who want to criticize it and say, oh, it's not really art, because it is art, but it is also craft at the same time. Art can be craft and can be also good work at the same time.
Totally.
So I just wanted to quickly...
can I just briefly mention that her mother was called Willie Posey? I mean...
Willie Posey?
The thing is, I think it's really important that we recognise all these women in her life and in her history.
But that's quite a name, though, isn't it?
It's a great name, but it's important that we recognise that she was important in her life. Willie Posey.
Willie Posey. And at that point, I want to also just mention just one other passage from my book here, which is a rather interesting passage about the products of immigration, as it were. So indeed, when we think about immigration, there are some extraordinary ideas around how terrible it's going to be for people who actually end up coming to this country or going to any country, actually, in fact. And the idea, of course, that they're going to take the jobs of British houses and British workers and so on and so on. But here, in fact, the move against the foreign encroachment on lucrative city trades in London was further consolidated in 1492 when the Painters Stainers Guild demanded that no painters within the city permitted to employ foreigners from beyond the city, and if they could not in the first instance acquire the equivalent painters of the same cost within the city of London. In other words, this was about British jobs for British workers, as it were. So I seem to remember that some other Prime Minister said that at some point, or Minister in the government said exactly the same thing. So it's not as though things have changed, as it were.
Yeah, and I think Faith Ringgold's coming from the same position of fighting for women and women of race to be recognised as well.
Yeah.
So going back to her work anyway, I want to go back. I want to jump from the work she was doing, which is not unimportant, but I think the work she made between 1963 and 67 is more important. To me personally, and that's created at the height of the civil rights movement as well. And so she makes her first sustained body of work, and this is something that's going to directly talk about race relations, talk about violence and fear and hypocrisy in America, and she's really, I think, the first example of a black female artist confronting race, and that series was called the American People series. And if you haven't checked it out, please do check it out, because it's the most extraordinary work. It's very violent and aggressive, but that's what was happening in 1963.
It's a reality of her life.
It's a reality,
Yes, yeah.
So she did a whole series of works after the 60s, and then she had the temerity to use an American flag in some of her works as well, which, as we all know,
sacred ground, isn't it?
As we all know, that's really dangerous, even nowadays as well. So she was quite abstract in some of her work as well.
Yeah. What do you think her lasting legacy is, though, James?
I think her lasting legacy is that I'd seen her work twice in the last year in museums, and so you're starting to see. And if you don't know her later work, which is her quilt work, particularly the Tar Beach series, which we're going to talk about, I think it's having presence, having presence in the art world, and it's a bit like Kerry James Marshall. Kerry James Marshall, one of the greatest.
Great show at the Royal Academy. Wonderful
great show last year at the Royal Academy.
Yeah, excellent show.
He is in my top 5 painters of all time. I love his work. But he said, when he was a kid, he was going around museums and not seeing people of colour on the walls. And he said, you know what? I'll do it. I'll make them. And that's what Faith Ringgold did as well, So you're seeing presence, and it's like, I personally am sick of going around museums and seeing the same old thing again and again. So I like to be jolted. And
And I personally really love going around museums and seeing the same old things again and again. Actually, in other words, art that's really, really old. So I think at that point, really, there's a sort of a point of divergence, but it's a good divergence, isn't it? That's what this is all about, isn't it? Really, in the end, But I can look at Botticelli forever, really. But there we are.
So then, if we jump with Faith Ringgold to the 1970s, that's really when she's starting to make a shift in her art towards fabric and quilting.
Mm-hmm.
As we said, quilting has been dismissed as a craft rather than fine art. So her work is still not being seen. And then a gallerist, the story goes, a gallerist saw a poster for her art for a gallery show, and said to herself, that would be a great children's book. Apparently the story is she was in a dentist, waiting in a dentist's waiting room, and there was a poster for Faith Ringgold. So it was really just luck, really, that she was
just luck.
And she made this luck that she became a children's author, which she loved being a children's author as well. So
I can see her as a children's author though. There's a certain look to a children's author, I think, and she's got that look.
And it's her work is well, she bases a lot of her work, like the character in the book is called Cassie, and she flies around Harlem, so she's an alter ego for Faith Ringgold.
Yes.
And she's an interesting character because she's based on these African flying dreams, so it's all referencing other points in history, but it's all done from the perspective of a child rather than how we think of an institution, if you like. So it's about fantasy and it's about joy. And in the same way with Renaissance, particularly Giotto, particularly Giotto, you're going to see like Judas will appear 4 or 5 times in the same fresco, and Cassie appears many, many times in the same fresco.
She's using that thing, because this is what we call in the Renaissance parlance continuous narrative.
Ooh la la.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Continuous narrative, where you have the character in the same colours or clothes throughout the scene, so that you know that it's the same character moving throughout the scenes. So this is a continuous narrative. So very clever. That's part of the Tar Beach series, though, isn't it?
The Tar Beach series is her quilts, and the Tar Beach. So what used to happen in Harlem in New York was on very boiling hot days, the families would take their drinks, their snacks, etc., up onto the roofs because they didn't have air conditioning, and the roofs had tar on them, and the tar would melt in the sun, but they would be lying on the tar, looking up at the stars, or in her case, she could actually see the Brooklyn Bridge, which is very important to her. Her grandfather worked on that bridge, and they're lying on the tar beach, so they called it a tar beach. And that's where in her children's books Cassie takes flight. It's from the Tar Beach.
Do you think that taking flight, because it's about this young black girl flying over Harlem at night, and in her imagination she claims the bridges and buildings denied to her, to her family. So she's so is this dream, is it an aspirational dream that becomes her art?
Well, she does talk about being very, very happy as a child, and I do think the flying over Harlem is aspirational, but it's also quite comforting as well. And I think she saw it as comforting. She saw the whole idea as comforting. She wanted the book to comfort children, And don't forget, when she's publishing this book, many young black kids still living in Harlem at the time before it got gentrified, they might have, for the very first time, seen a black character in a children's book.
Well, that's quite extraordinary. It took much longer for that to happen in the UK.
And she is going to win the Coretta King Award for books. So it's an important book. It's still being published today. It's still one of the big best-selling children's books.
But don't you think, James, that flying always represents freedom?
Flight. Yeah, I do.
Because it's about you're free.
Your shackles are off. Your metaphorical shackles are off.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a part of that for me, I feel that it's her aspirational feeling of being free.
Yeah.
And being able to go wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
Because of course, for Black Americans at that time, African Americans, you couldn't go wherever you wanted to go.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and I think it's having a female character as well is important.
Yeah.
She's showing that kind of empowerment.
Yeah, female empowerment.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've read the book, the children's book at all.
I haven't actually read it, James.
So I read it for my research when I was doing the book, when I was doing my chapter on her. And so she understood a really basic thing when she was writing that book, and that was that she didn't have doors opened for her.
Exactly.
She had no doors open for her.
Yeah.
So she had to find her own door. She had to find her own entrance, and for her portal, if you like, was via children's books.
Yeah.
And that children's book, I don't care what anyone says, just by the fact that kid is in it, that Cassie is in it, it's a political book.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Really, and what they say about authors. We're authors. They say you should write what you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And having a black girl as a hero, a working class family at the center of the story, that's really important. And it's showing in a way that imagination is a form of power. It's a what's the word? It's a superpower.
Yeah,
Imagination is a power of its kind, and that's the flight movement, if you like.
As I say, that you can't enslave someone's mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and let's not forget that children, they're not so aware of injustice as adults are, it was very accepted very quickly. It was in schools, by the way. I don't know if it's been taken out of schools in this day and age.
Well, depends on which states in America you're in.
Depends on which states you're in. There are so many banned books, as we know, in America, and so I don't know if this particular book has been banned. But anyway, the most important thing is that she found another route for her work to be seen. So. We quite often think there's only the gallery system.
Yes,
in our very first podcast, we talked about how Instagram is another way of people are being seen. There are other ways of people being seen.
Yeah. Do you think she embraced all of that new tech?
No, not really. No, I don't. I think she was, she was getting on a bit by this point. And her quilts, by the way, you might not know this, but are hand stitched, and she has writing stitched into them. They're very, very delicate. There's lots of work involved.
So she didn't have a production line like Grace and Perry?
No, or Grace and Perry or Ghirlandaio.
Yeah, Ghirlandaio. Domenico Ghirlandaio. Folaiulo.
I actually, the truth is I don't really know how many people she had working for her, but I'm sure she had a few, so and once you get in your 70s, it's pretty much harder to sew and stuff.
And there's something collaborative and community about making quilts, because
making quilts are a collaborative process.
Exactly, because the quilt makers of G Bend, that's how they made quilts. They made together as a community, collaborative. Families as well together. So there's something about it, isn't there? Really, that's look. I was just looking at it. In the French collection, she imagines a black woman artist in early 20th century Paris. She did that apparently.
Oh, okay. What is this piece?
Yeah, I'm just reading from your notes, James.
Oh, okay. But she, a lot of the work she did was very much based around race, because that was, it was an important part of her life as well. And the great thing about it is when she was doing this work in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, it wasn't being seen, but the great thing about, at least we're seeing it now in some museums. When they had a great exhibition at Barbican a couple of years ago, one of her quilts was in there, and it just blew me away. I just thought, that was 3 years ago. And when I saw that piece, I thought, I want a chapter on her in my book.
Yeah. And what I think is positive about this whole thing of great, for Faith Ringgold is that at least she was recognised within her lifetime and had a show at a major institution, or several major institutions within her lifetime. And it could easily have not gone that way.
Yeah, and she paved the way for a lot of other artists in America as well, like Kari Walker and all these other artists. She was ahead of the game in a way, her politics. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's her life, isn't it? Really. So Did you want to? Yeah. Did you want to add something from your book, James?
I was just going to finish up about her children's books, actually. So because my chapter is about Tar Beach, so it's 1991. So Tar Beach launched her unexpected career as a published author and illustrator of children's books. The same year, it was named a Caldecott Honour Book and is still in print today. Since 1992, her children's books allowed her to extend the message of her quilts, freedom, empowerment, heritage and resilience, to a new global audience who may not have encountered her artwork in museums and in a format accessible to young people. Ringgold passed away in April 2024, but her legacy lives on through her art practice. As she wrote in her memoirs, which are fantastic, by the way, there is now an audience of children who will grow up knowing that an artist does not have to be white or male, who will be in our next artists, museum directors, curators, collectors, art critics, and teachers of art.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that really comes back to the question I asked. What do you think her legacy was? Well, there you have it.
Yeah, I think
that's a legacy.
Yeah, I think her legacy was that, and
Yeah.
I think it's I think it's important when we're walking around museums that we acknowledge that there are other people talking. We're not the only ones talking,
Yeah.
Like, I'm not the only one talking, you're not the only one
Indeed.
talking.
Yeah.
Everyone's got their story, and some people are great at getting that story out, and some are not.
Yeah.
And Faith Ringgold was one of those people who really knew how to get her story out.
She did, yeah. But she had a lot of obstacles, and she managed to get past those obstacles as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, all power to her. I think what a great artist, really. And she had a good long life as well.
Yeah.
How old was she when she died? Yeah.
I don't know. I'd have
It's
to
a maths,
check on
it's
that
a maths
one,
question again, I'm afraid, James.
Another maths
Yeah.
question. Let me just
Yeah,
check my
yeah,
notes. I'll
yeah,
check my notes. There
yeah,
you go. Oh,
yeah.
so she was born in 1930 and died in 2024.
Yeah.
That means she was 94 when she died.
94.
Good maths, huh?
Yeah, that's not bad at all. That's very good maths. It's better
94
than my
when she
maths.
died. And she was working in 94. I love the fact that artists, Michelangelo, all these great artists, they worked till they were in the 70s, 80s, 90s,
Absolutely, yeah.
And so being an artist, you can keep on working. So, keep on working.
Keep on working. Absolutely. Yeah. So don't forget, folks, like and subscribe to our podcast, Primo and Payne, Great Art Explained.
And thank you very much for listening to us again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.